Now the news with Michael Burke and David Robertson.
Vauxhall's ending car production at Luton with the loss of 2,000 jobs. After a century making cars, Luton pays the price of change in the industry. President Clinton in Dundalk tonight trying to breathe life into the peace process. Tension across America as the Supreme Court decides on the next president. And air travel in Britain is set to double in the next 20 years.
In Scotland, it's taken 2 decades, but a Scottish council finally apologises to victims of this child abuser. And too big for Scottish football, but UEFA hasn't yet sanctioned a breakaway league for the old firm.
Good evening. The British car industry suffered another body blow today with the unexpected announcement that Vauxhall was stopping car production at Luton after 95 years. The decision will mean the loss of 2,000 jobs. Vauxhall's parent company, General Motors, is also cutting jobs in America and in continental Europe. It blames rapidly changing market conditions and the fact that the industry is making more cars than customers want to buy.
This plant seemed the safest in Britain until last Friday, when the message came from Detroit that it would have to close. Too much factory in Europe, not enough sales. Vauxhall executives, as surprised as anyone, digested the news over the weekend, told ministers, then their own workers this evening, before spelling out the reasoning.
For cars that are manufactured here and exported to Europe, and we do export a lot, there is a cost penalty to manufacture them here rather than on the continent if they're going to be sold on the continent due to the level of the pound.
But the Vectra's the real problem, a car that's not taken the market by storm. Customers now prefer smaller cars, leaving the Vectra trailing. A new model destined for Luton will now go to the continent. Luton's the first plant General Motors built in Europe back in 1905. Today has stunned local people.
Bolt out the blue, I just can't believe it.
Guys with mortgages and everything else and kids, obviously, it's frightening.
I mean, I'm the only person who owns money for my house, and I think personally for me it'll be a great shock.
But 2 years ago there was doubt over Luton, but it was resolved when unions promised new ways of working, the government promised many millions of pounds, and General Motors promised many millions of dollars to modernise, to build a successor to the Vectra.
There would be at least a medium-term future for the Vauxhall plant, including a new car line. I feel that that's been torn up, and I think that's disgraceful.
There's no logical reason for this plant to be under threat of closure. The British government, the workforce and the unions have reached agreements only a few months ago for new models, and we expect those agreements to be met. Nothing's changed in 3 months.
But it has. A decision in Detroit to tackle mounting European losses, and Ford's decision to close its Dagenham plant seems to have prompted General Motors executives to think similar thoughts. General Motors is losing something like £600 million making cars in Europe each year, and the Luton factory is a casualty of that, but it goes wider. Nissan in Sunderland, BMW in Oxford, Honda in Swindon, all of them are finding that the climate for car making in Britain is getting much, much harsher. Stephen Evans, BBC News, Luton.
The job losses in Luton are part of 10,000 redundancies worldwide announced by General Motors in Detroit. It's the latest set of cuts as the international car makers are forced to respond to the changing global market. GM says today's restructuring is essential to return the company to profitability.
Today, General Motors ditched a part of its history. Oldsmobile, the oldest car brand in the United States, was axed by GM as part of its global clear-out. It's a relic of the days when cars were expensive to buy and expensive to make. Today, it's very different. Cars are no longer luxury items, and technology has slashed costs. In some markets, car firms have ended up simply making too many cars of a particular type. General Motors' European operations are losing money. So its decision to end production of the relatively unpopular Vectra at Luton is understandable.
GM Europe's total installed production capacity will be reduced by more than 400,000 units by 2004. These steps, plus others such as GME's plans to significantly reduce material costs, will help return them to profitability.
These days, it's fairly easy for car makers to shift production from one country to another. At the same time, in Europe, they're making more vehicles than customers actually want to buy. The upshot is that car making is being concentrated in fewer and fewer places, and the fear is that the United Kingdom is not one of them. In the past 20 years, car making in Britain has expanded rapidly. In 1982, we made less than 1 million cars a year. By 1999, thanks largely to the arrival of Japanese car makers, that had jumped to nearly 2 million. But after cutbacks at Rover, Ford and now Vauxhall, UK output is forecast to fall back to 1.3 million cars a year. It's not all about cutbacks, though. Here at Ryton, near Coventry, Peugeot makes the 206. It's the fastest-selling model in the company's history.
Product does matter because, of course, if you have overcapacity in the business, it's the guys who've got the good product, the sexy product like the 206 at Ryton, who actually succeed. But, of course, in a business which is actually in a reasonably steady state, it's possible to carry an unsuccessful model like the Vectra.
But today, the car business is not in a stable condition, and car makers are becoming increasingly ruthless about discarding unsuccessful models and the plants which make them. Greg Wood, BBC News.
Thousands of people have filled the streets of the Irish town of Dundalk to welcome the American President Bill Clinton. The President arrived in the town close to the Northern Ireland border as part of a 3-day tour. He urged the crowd to redouble their efforts for peace and said the past was history, not destiny.
A hero's welcome in Dundalk, a border town with the reputation of being a militant Irish Republican heartland. Some argue that Northern Ireland is President Clinton's only real foreign policy success, but with this kind of welcome, it's obvious why he likes coming here. This was chiefly an economic and aspirational speech. It had been seen as a litmus test of what might come of this visit in hard political terms. But in an area where those who carried out the Omagh bombing, the so-called real IRA, have their base, there was only one reference to that atrocity.
You cannot win by making your neighbor lose. 2 years ago, after the horrid bombing in Omagh, you good people filled these streets. Young people came not wanting to lose their dreams. Older people came because they wanted a chance to live in peace before they rest in peace. You stared violence in the face and said, no more. You stood up for peace then, and I ask you, stand up for peace today, tomorrow, rest of your lives.
Indeed, there was and is massive opposition here to the bombing, but it was left to the Irish Prime Minister to have harder words for those who still espouse violence.
Peace is a living reality in which few could have thought possible. The people of Ireland treasure peace in every part of the island, and we totally reject that tiny minority who seek to destroy it.
The President's first key talks of the trip were with Mr Ahern at the Irish Parliament on this, his third visit to Ireland. An unprecedented 8-year commitment to one of the most intractable problems in the world. Mr Clinton said reversal in the peace process was not an option. There was also what's become a presidential tradition, a visit to a pub in North Dublin. The First Lady was reminded that she's now a politician in her own right.
Congratulations on your election. Thank you so much.
There aren't many chances to meet the people, but there's respect and even affection among many for the part Mr Clinton's played. The most familiar of Irish songs to finish, but there are serious problems in the peace process, and unless there's tough talking in Belfast, there may not be much movement this week. Dennis Murray, BBC News, Dublin.
And Nick Witchell is in Dundalk. Nick, extraordinary occasion there tonight, but how do you think the people of Dundalk actually responded to what he had to say?
It was extraordinary, Mike. President Clinton only left here about 10 minutes ago. He spent more than half an hour shaking hands. What I thought was significant, this was a very warm response, a spontaneous reaction from the crowd. Significant that whenever he urged the widening and the deepening of the peace process, the crowd reacted overwhelmingly. Now, of course, this is a crowd which wants peace, which has seen the benefits of political stability. What is critical, of course, is how will those members of the dissident Republican groups, principally the real IRA, listening perhaps in bars not a few hundred yards from here, how will they react? And it must be doubtful that they will succumb to the blandishments, both of Mr. Clinton and of Bertie Ahern. They've broken away from the IRA. They've resisted every attempt so far to encourage them to put down their weapons and to join the peace process.
Indeed. I mean, in practical political terms, what difference is all this likely to make to those intractable problems with the peace process, the paramilitaries giving up weapons, the change in the structure of the RUC and so on?
President Clinton has made it clear that he hasn't come here to negotiate the details of the peace process. He simply doesn't have time. He's only got one day now in Northern Ireland when he meets the party leaders there. He only has 5.5 more weeks in the White House. But what he does hope that he can be is a catalyst. He can encourage the leaders on all sides to remember the big picture, to step back from the squabbling and remember what is at stake here. He can't force them into a deal, but he can help and encourage them, he hopes, to face up to those very difficult issues which the two sides still have to resolve.
Nick Witchell, thanks very much. The 9 justices of the Supreme Court in Washington are still deliberating in the case that's expected to decide finally who'll be the next American president. 5 weeks after polling day, the issue at its heart is still whether to allow the hand recounts of the Florida ballots. The decision could come at any time.
The party's over, oh, it's time to hang it up.
The longer the wait, the more bizarre the spectacle. Die-hard Bush and Gore supporters at the Supreme Court.
Who else are you going to blame it on?
Arguing the case outside as the 9 justices wrestle with it inside. Bush supporters confident the ruling will end this election fight.
There'll be a new saying in America. Instead of a sore loser, it'll be a Gore loser.
But I found Gore supporters sticking to the message they've taken through the courts.
I'm still holding out for one count where, every possible vote is counted. I still don't think that's happened. I mean, yeah, you hear the Bush supporters saying we've had 1, 2, 3 counts, but we've never had a count with all the votes yet.
The 9 justices have been deliberating for more than a day. Their last ruling was a 5-4 split, conservatives against liberals in favor of George Bush. So Al Gore, heading to the office today, has to be braced for a legal blow which would finish off his hopes of the White House. But there is still a chance the court will sanction a partial Florida recount.
Florida has not failed to make a choice.
Amid the uncertainty, the Republican-controlled Florida legislature decided to step in. Today, members voted to endorse a Bush slate of electors in Florida as a protection against further vote counting. Democrats were furious.
This isn't about protecting Florida's electors. This is brass knuckles partisan politics at its very worst.
George Bush has been lying low in Texas, his last public appearance yesterday. He's tantalizingly close to the White House, but until America's highest court has its say, he can take nothing for granted. Stephen Sacker, BBC News, Washington.
And Stephen Sacker is at the Supreme Court now. Stephen, why is it taking the Supreme Court so long? After all this time, what is there to talk about?
Well, Mike, I think they're trying to balance the urgency of this case against the need to get it right, to come up with a rigorous and conclusive ruling that this nation can rally around. And after all, their perspective isn't just tomorrow's morning newspapers, it is the history books. In essence, I think this court does not want to be seen to be divided on straight partisan lines. When they met over the weekend to temporarily stop the hand recount in Florida, it was a 5-4 split decision, conservatives against liberals, and I would guess that right now they're trying to find a way of avoiding that 5-4 split, whether it be to come up with a solution in terms of a recount where they impose an objective standard for a new recount of some of the ballots in Florida, which obviously Al Gore would want, or whether it be, and this is perhaps more likely, coming up with a solution whereby some of the liberals agree with the conservatives that this election has to be brought to an end and there will be no more recounts. Either way, they don't want this to be seen as partisan.
I thought today, December the 12th, was a deadline in the constitutional process of picking a president, and yet it seems to be slipping by.
You're absolutely right. There seem to have been so many deadlines in this story, and we've missed them all. The 12th was a deadline. Florida was supposed to appoint its electors to the Electoral College today. But the Democrats, at least, argue the 12th doesn't really matter. It's more of a technical deadline. They point to the 18th. And there is no doubt that the 18th of December is the real deadline, because then the Electoral College meets and the states have to vote for the president. So there's no getting around it. In 6 days' time, Florida has to come up with electors for president. And as things stand, George Bush is going to get those votes unless the Supreme Court intervenes and does activate a new hand recount in Florida.
Stephen Sacker, thanks. Here, the former deputy chairman of the Conservative Party, Lord Archer, has appeared in court to plead not guilty to 5 charges, including perjury and perverting the course of justice. The author's accused of asking a friend to lie for him during a libel case he brought against the Daily Star newspaper in 1987. The Abbey National Bank has rejected a second takeover approach from Britain's third largest bank, Lloyds TSB. The Abbey National said its board thought Lloyds' £18.2 billion offer was inadequate. The Environment Agency has issued 9 severe flood warnings this evening. It says the Midlands and Wales are most at risk, with 5 severe warnings on the River Severn between Shrewsbury and Gloucester. Water levels aren't as high as they were a month ago, but the next 48 hours will still be critical. The price of flying from Britain's busiest airports may have to rise to cope with the huge projected increase in air travel. Air traffic is forecast to double in the next 20 years, and the government says raising the cost of flying from busy airports such as Heathrow may encourage people to make more use of smaller regional airports.
This year, the number of people travelling through our airports will reach 170 million. In 20 years' time, the number could have more than doubled. Meeting that forecast would mean building the equivalent of a new Heathrow every 5 years. The government faces huge problems about what to do.
It's a very difficult balancing act that the government has got to strike between the economic benefits of growth in the aviation industry and between the costs that come with that in terms of the costs imposed on congestion on the surface transport system and the environmental and social costs which fall on people within the UK.
Today, the government suggested some options for controlling demand, raising landing charges at congested airports to force flights elsewhere, developing regional airports outside southeast England, and a tax on aviation fuel to reflect the environmental damage caused by aircraft emissions. But the owner of Britain's biggest airports says they must expand or lose out to Europe.
We are very much talking about London competing with Paris, Frankfurt and Amsterdam. So we believe that we should increase capacity, we should do it in a sustainable fashion, and we should try to make sure that the wealth that our airports and industry generate are in fact funneled back into local communities.
But the communities split over the new second runway at Manchester. Some welcome the extra jobs, others have protested against the loss of trees and green fields. East Midlands Airport is another regional success, again at a price. It's doubled in size in 10 years, but that's meant more night flights, more noise.
There are people that live around the UK's airports who already believe that enough's enough. They suffer from noise, local air quality problems, and there really will be a sort of huge public reaction with this scale of growth.
The first test of public reaction will come next year, when the government decides whether to approve plans for a 5th terminal here at Heathrow. And then the really difficult long-term policy for the whole of the UK will have to follow. Simon Montague, BBC News at Heathrow.
A British Airways jumbo jet has overshot the runway at Heathrow Airport. The flight from Boston landed just after 7:30 this evening with more than 100 passengers on board. A spokeswoman for BA said the plane was now stuck in the grass and there were no injuries. It's still unclear why the plane came off the runway, which has now been closed. A head teacher who was cleared on appeal of slapping a 10-year-old pupil is to face a disciplinary hearing by governors at her school in South Wales. Marjorie Evans has been told she'll have to answer further allegations against her. Teaching unions say she's the victim of a witch hunt.
Today's announcement by the local education authority means Marjorie Evans, who's on paid leave from this school in Monmouthshire, will have to face a panel of school governors to consider allegations which were made several months ago. It was in July that Marjorie Evans was convicted of slapping a pupil with special needs at her school. But she appealed and was cleared of assault 2 months later. Despite walking free from court, Mrs. Evans was told she'd remain suspended while police investigated further allegations against her concerning the way pupils had been treated at the school. However, the Crown Prosecution Service has since decided to take no further action, and Mrs. Evans' union says she's now the victim of a witch hunt.
Marge has always refuted any allegation of mistreatment of children. The NUT continues to support her very vigorously, and we will be preparing to support her at the disciplinary. We hope it will take place as soon as possible.
As for Mrs. Evans, she's received a letter of support from Prince Charles, inviting her to meet with him to discuss what he calls her difficult circumstances. The 56-year-old head teacher says she's determined to fight on to clear her name. Gareth Jones, BBC News, Cardiff.
A new watchdog is to bring together regulation of television, radio, telecommunications and the internet for the first time, replacing a clutch of separate regulators. The Office of Communications, or Ofcom, is part of a package of proposals on the media and communications industry from the government today.
Home Choice in London is a pay TV service with a difference. It comes down an ordinary phone line. The old distinctions between broadcasting and telecommunications are breaking down. So the government wants to overhaul the alphabet soup of regulators responsible for the two industries, issuing licenses, drawing up guidelines and handling complaints from the public. In future, they'll be combined into a single body dubbed Ofcom, a move broadly welcomed by the opposition and the existing regulators.
The broad thrust to deregulate, to create a single regulatory body, to simplify the structures, quite happy with that. I just wish they'd get on with it.
The Independent Television Commission said there was less need for detailed regulation when there were more companies competing with one another, but Ofcom would be able to crack the whip.
We also welcome bringing the regulators together to create a powerful body when it's needed to face big companies, sometimes multinational companies, when you do need to intervene to protect consumers and in the public interest.
The BBC governors are happy because the White Paper doesn't recommend they lose many of their powers to the new Ofcom, as they'd feared.
It contains sensible proposals which maintain the independence of the modern BBC within a common regulatory framework. It also emphasises the continuing importance of public service broadcasting in a changing and increasingly competitive environment.
One consumer watchdog was disappointed the BBC's still largely outside Ofcom's control.
The doors have been opened, but not as wide as we would like them to be. I mean, our view is that it makes no sense for consumers any longer to see the BBC regulated separately from the rest of the public service broadcasting environment.
But there will be a new consumer panel to represent the interests of viewers, listeners and phone users.
What it's there to do is reflect the views of consumers, of citizens, of customers in a variety of different ways, including very much what sort of programs, how those programs are being put together, whether content standards are falling.
The White Paper leaves out a lot. For instance, the thorny question of changing the rules on media ownership has been put off till after the election. But the government's hope is that viewers and listeners should notice little difference. Nick Hyam, BBC News.
Football, and in tonight's Worthington Cup quarter-finals, Birmingham beat Sheffield Wednesday 2-0. The match at Selhurst Park between Crystal Palace and Sunderland was postponed shortly before kick-off because of a waterlogged pitch, and the weather also forced the abandonment of Manchester City's game against Ipswich in the first half with the score at 1-1. England's cricketers have arrived home from their Test Series victory in Pakistan. England are the first visiting side ever to beat Pakistan in Karachi. The captain, Nasser Hussain, said the success was all down to team spirit.
The England captain was delayed at Heathrow this morning because they'd lost one of his suitcases. But he did come through with a smile and one extra piece of luggage, the trophy for England's series win over Pakistan. A trophy which 10 weeks ago when the tour started, virtually nobody predicted England could possibly win. It was a very sweet achievement.
To go out to Pakistan after 13 years and to win like that is just phenomenal, and usually I'm playing down what we do. But on this occasion, that was something special, and I think whoever was in that squad, from our physio to our captain, had been out there, they'd have been punching the air in delight because we'd worked so hard for it.
That's through, that's an inside edge, this could be it.
The historic win came in near darkness, the final day of the final test, and the first time Pakistan have ever been beaten at their headquarters, Karachi. Jubilation in an England dressing room with newfound purpose.
There are some very good things going on in our dressing room. We got a very fine coach in Duncan Fletcher. We got good backroom staff, and we got some good players, and we're showing consistency in selection, and everyone just wanting to do well.
England can savour this victory for a while, but they know their true measure will come against the best in the world, Australia, in the Ashes series next summer. Adam Minot, BBC News, Heathrow Airport.
OK, it's 25 past 10. I'll be back a little later with the latest on the day's headlines. But now, the news where you are.
Good evening. A Scottish council has finally offered a public apology to victims of a paedophile who was in charge of a children's home. Peter Harley is serving a 15-year sentence for abuse at Merkland's residential home in Moffat. 20 years ago, 16 children were abused in his care. Dumfries and Galloway Council has been accused of doing too little, too late.
Peter Harley was jailed for 15 years in 1996 for a series of vile sexual attacks on boys. He admitted 17 charges against 16 different victims. The trial judge said the crimes were shocking and disgusting. Merkland Home's closure in 1982 brought to an end Harley's evil 5-year regime, but not the living nightmare of his victims. Some turned to crime, drink or drugs. Many have found relationships difficult or impossible. At least 2 have taken their own lives. This woman lost her husband last year.
What started off as an underlying depression deteriorated to the extent he couldn't bear to live. He couldn't face the memories that started to come flooding back, and it destroyed him just totally.
Merkland was run by the local council. Today it apologised. The council's move was welcomed by some Merkland victims who've been seeking justice for years. So was the launch of a telephone helpline and the offer of psychological counselling and legal advice. Newspaper adverts will be placed to try to find ex-Merkland residents. Records are so bad, no one knows exactly how many there are, but it could be 200. The council believes it's not too late to help.
The Scottish Qualifications Authority is warning there could be more serious problems with next year's exams. The admission came as its chief executive revealed that 187 schools and colleges have missed 2 deadlines to register for the 2001 exams.
This will be the scene on May the 14th, 2001, as thousands of pupils across Scotland put pen to paper in standard grade English, the first of next year's exams. Yet 5 months away, the facts are 187 schools or colleges, a third of those who should be registered, have so far failed to do so, ignoring in the process 2 deadlines and consistent persuasion from SQA staff. A spokesman for Scotland's head teachers blamed software problems which he said the SQA were aware of. But today the exam body's chief executive would not attribute blame to anyone for the inability of his organisation to jump this, the first hurdle of the exams process.
We would ask the Directors of Education and indeed the centres, if they have still to submit their registrations, that they do so as quickly as they possibly can.
I want to say that it will never happen again.
First Minister Henry McLeish as recently as last Sunday's Holyrood programme, claiming there could be no repeat. But today, the SQA's new chairman, in for just 4 weeks, said he'd encountered Dickensian-style procedures, which will take at least 3 years to sort out. So was it premature for political leaders to say next year's exams will be fine?
There is no reason why this can't be an entirely successful year. My concern is our resilience if problems come along. We have a manual process which has a limited ability to cope with problems.
Still a possibility that many candidates will have to spend the autumn months, as happened this year, sorting out a mess.
It would be our objective that that couldn't and shouldn't happen. What I can't give you is a guarantee.
Scotland's biggest ever drugs seizure has led to 3 Dutch sailors being given the maximum sentence of 14 years each. £43 million worth of cannabis was discovered on board the Red Scorpion yacht off the coast of Aberdeen. At the High Court in Edinburgh, the judge, Lord Hardy, said he would have imposed an even greater penalty on the men had the law allowed. An outbreak of salmonella poisoning, which struck down 92 people in the autumn, has been traced to 25 Chinese restaurants and takeaways. The Food Standards Agency said it was now investigating whether the outbreak was caused by chicken or duck. The bulk of the cases were in Lanarkshire, where 47 people were diagnosed, although cases were recorded all over Scotland. UEFA have conceded that Rangers and Celtic are too big for Scottish football, but haven't sanctioned a breakaway league. However, European football's ruling body has agreed to review their club competitions in a bid to increase television revenue for the old firm and other clubs, which must also play to a limited television audience.
It was a high-powered get-together. Celtic and Rangers, backed by the chief executives of the SFA and the SPL, David Taylor and Roger Mitchell. BBC Scotland had exclusive access as the Old Firm joined 10 other club representatives from 5 other nations, all with the same problem: limited TV income because of small populations. And after 3 hours, UEFA conceded that the Old Firm do have a case, and there is a drastic need for change.
We are now feeling that smaller and middle-sized leagues are drained of their players, of their best players, and the healthy balance in these leagues has gone or has worsened compared to the past.
The clubs have been planning for months to quit Scotland and form a new pan-European league, but always wanted to set it up with the approval of the European Association.
We've always said it would never be an easy road, and I think we've said that from day one. Football is not, it's a minefield to get through all the complexities. But I would say it's moving ahead in a positive manner in the context that they do understand that clubs like ourselves do have a problem that needs addressing.
UEFA will now create a working group to study the situation, but the smart money says that the UEFA Cup will be revamped in a league format. The SFA, meanwhile, have monitored the Old Firm movements all down the line.
The idea will be reviewed in the context of the overall review of European competitions, and whatever happens, I think that it will lead to more European football for our top clubs in Scotland in years to come, and that for me could only be a good thing.
Let's stay with football, and there are 3 Scottish Cup results tonight. In the first round, Brechin City defeated Forfar Athletic 3-0, and in the first round replays, East Fife beat Albion Rovers 2-0, while East Stirlingshire went down 1-0 to Dumbarton. Queen of the South against Clydebank was postponed. Let's return now to Michael Burke in London.
The main news again tonight, the British car industry has suffered another major blow with the announcement that after a century making cars, Vauxhall is to stop car production at Luton with the loss of 2,000 jobs. Vauxhall's parent company blames rapidly changing market conditions. President Clinton in Ireland has told a crowd of thousands in the small border town of Dundalk to redouble their efforts for peace. And America awaits a crucial decision from the US Supreme Court on the case that will finally decide who's to be the next president. Newsnight starting now over on BBC Two, but from the 10 o'clock news, good night.